Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Partnership for Food Traceability pilot webinar recording. I'm joined today by Eric Marshall, who is Executive Director of the Partnership for Food Traceability, and I'm Ben Miller with the partnership as well. When I'm not doing this type of thing, I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the Atchison Group, and so we're a food safety consulting firm that works with food companies across the supply chain. Just by way of background, I started my career as an epidemiologist doing traceback investigations. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, but we're excited to share information today with you about three of the pilots that the Partnership for Food Traceability will be hosting. So, Eric, welcome. Please introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, good to be with everyone. Eric Marshall, as Ben mentioned, I serve as Executive Director of the Partnership for Food Traceability. Uh, Part of my role and capacity here is a principal with Levitt Partners, a health policy consulting firm out of Washington, D.C., and I've spent the better part of the last decade working on various traceability initiatives domestically and globally, with a heavy emphasis particularly in pharmaceutical traceability.
Perfect. So, Eric, what is the PFT, and what's our role in coordinating these pilots?
Yeah, so at the simple level, PFT is really an industry collaborative and an FDA public-private partnership working to support a more efficient and streamlined implementation of interoperable food traceability. We sometimes call it the town square, right? This idea that a lot of different people are doing a lot of really good work on pieces of food traceability for different sectors, different industries, different standards, different technologies. And PFT is really intended to be kind of that town square where all those ideas can come together and be shared and exchanged and kind of vetted out to support people in identifying the best way that makes sense for them to move forward with their implementation. And that idea of bringing people together, learning together, cross-pollinating ideas is really the idea of this pilot program. So these pilots that we'll be talking about here today and over the series are really focused on that intersection of industry, government, the technologies that support implementation, and not PFT is not executing, running, coordinating the actual day-to-day pilot activity. Really, we're approaching this more as a framework for surfacing and sharing the lessons that people are learning in pilots they've already done, pilots they have underway, or in identifying where they may want to come together and do some additional piloting to test out certain ideas. But again, providing that framework for people to, in a consistent way, share those learnings out to the broader community through PFT.
Yeah, and I think it's important to emphasize here. Well, we do have membership in PFT. The concept around these pilots is that they're open to anybody that wants to participate. So hopefully, people listening in that may not be members, you're welcome to participate in any of these pilots. Eric, we have three pilots launching here, just at a high level, and we'll go through, more specific detail later on in this webinar. But how do each relate to the rule and, at a high level, of what are we trying to test with each one of those?
Yeah. So, as you said, three pilots that we've got set up here. The first is focused on flexible methods of achieving traceability. So, as most people probably know, the FY26 appropriations law that funded FDA required FDA to go back and look at and consider different alternate flexible methods to achieving compliance and achieving traceability. And so, there's been a lot of conversation going on in PFT, outside of PFT, with regard to what are some of those different flexible methods that could help us more efficiently and in a more streamlined, more rapid way get to traceability. And so this first pilot is really focused on testing out some of those ideas, things like calculated or ranges of lot codes, for example. So where people have done that and have comparators there, kind of surfacing some of those learnings. Second, as everybody also hopefully probably knows, the law requires organizations not just to have those records, but then to be able to share those records in an an electronic sortable spreadsheet or ESS. And so the second pilot is really looking at that process. Once the data is out there and has followed a product through the supply chain, how do you gather it, compile it, and communicate it back in an electronic sortable spreadsheet? And then the third pilot is really focused on interoperability. So recognizing, one of the core themes in many of the conversations we have is that different approaches, different processes make sense for different channels, different industries, different product types. Recognizing that variability and that need for flexibility, how do you get everybody speaking the same language from a data perspective? And so that's the focus of that third pilot.
Great. And when we look at timing, why should companies be interested in participating right now rather than waiting until the compliance date, which right now stands at July 20th, 2028? Why participate now?
Yeah, the rule's been out there for almost 4 years now, right? And so if you look at that timeline to 2028, we're about two-thirds of the way there. So while things have shifted a little bit and flexibilities are being considered, people have spent a good bit of time thinking about this. There are people who have done piloting and testing and tested different approaches. And the time is coming quickly where people are going to have to start making those decisions about how they're going to proceed. So I think it's a good time to be able to leverage and bring together and share those learnings from the past almost 4 years, while there's still time to kind of inform how people proceed forward. And ultimately, I think this pilot program, the way we've got it structured, is more of that information exchange component. Really means we're going to get out of it what we put into it. And so if we can get to a place where we can really start to surface broadly all the different things that are happening and are being tested in all the different pockets and corners of the ecosystem, that could be some really valuable and important information for folks to be able to have visibility to. But it means people got to jump in and share those lessons and learnings. Again, as we said, this doesn't mean you've got to go set up and run a new pilot. If you've done testing or piloting that has learnings, just get that out there, share that through PFT and out to the broader community. And as you said at the top, you don't have to be a PFT member for it. And so this is something that we really want to cast a broad net and make sure we're sharing those learnings as broadly as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. This is really a supply chain exercise, right? The compliance with FSMA 204 is not something one company does. I mean, one company has to be compliant, but we have to share this data up and down the supply chain. And so to me, these pilots are wonderful ways to start to do that, especially when we talk about interoperability and just the way that you're capturing and sharing that data. So I think I really appreciate you taking the time to inform and educate the audience a little bit about the work that we're doing at PFT. But I know we're collectively excited about where these pilots are headed. And up next, we're going to do a little context setting, learn a little bit about the background around the traceability rule, and then go into background about each one of the individual pilots. So thank you, Eric. Appreciate it. We're fortunate to be joined today by Angela Fields and Adam Friedlander, both with FDA Core, and they're close partners to the Partnership for Food Traceability. It's the public-private partnership, and we have the privilege of working with both of them on a regular basis. So Angela, Adam, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us, Ben and Eric. It's always a pleasure for us to have this opportunity to talk a little bit about the work that we do, especially when it comes to food traceability rules. So we're really grateful for this opportunity to, interface with industry and explain and do some more outreach as it relates to the rule, because it's really vital for the compliance with the rule and implementation of the rule. So as you mentioned, my name is Angela Fields. I am a member of FDA's Coordinated Outbreak Response Evaluation and Emergency Preparedness Group. So we are the group that handles the foodborne illness outbreaks for the Food and Drug Administration. But within that, we have a section of our office that focuses a lot on traceability and supply chain. And so we participate in a lot of initiatives as it relates to traceability. Specifically, I've been involved in a lot of the policy development as it relates to the food traceability rule and the guidance documents that correspond with it, as well as assisting in some of the initiatives for implementation and compliance of the rule. Adam?
Yeah, thanks, Angela. So I'm also on the Core Plus EP team. And, you know, Angela, myself, and a few others within our office, along with the outbreak investigation work, we're so heavily involved in the food traceability, not only the rule writing, policy development aspect of it, but also the implementation and technology aspect as well. So we work very closely I'm also the designated liaison, agency liaison to PFT. So maybe many of the folks who are watching this webinar will recognize both of our names. We sit on the calls every week. But we also give a lot of presentations. We do a lot of outreach and education with the food industry. We help with the curriculum development for the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance. And it's hard to believe that it's almost been 4 years since the final rule was published. And we still have a lot of work to do in raising awareness about the requirements of the rule, also answering those technical questions of, I have this process in my company. How can I reach compliance? Knowing that we still have a few more years until compliance, but our goal is to be as resourceful and helpful as possible to make this traceability rule work for everyone.
I think most of us know this rule is, we talk about it as FSMA 204, which is actually part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, Section 204 that kind of put traceability on the roadmap, if you will. The actual name of the rule is the Final Rule on Requirements for Additional Traceability Records for Certain Human Foods. So, Angela, why did we need this rule, and why aren't current record-keeping practices adequate for FDA to trace foods back during investigations?
Thanks, Ben, for that question. And I think it's really important to understand, our history and where we came from to understand why this rule is so fundamental to our ability to keep consumers safe. In the case of foodborne illness outbreaks or evidence of contaminated food, the ability to follow the movement of the food through the supply chain really helps FDA identify the points in that particular supply chain where contamination may have occurred. It also helps us identify the source of the product and gives us an opportunity to work with industry to ensure that we can remove any contaminated food from the marketplace as quickly as possible. It's really important, as we've talked about on numerous of these PFT meetings, that efficient traceability really enables FDA and the food industry to take action as fast as possible with the goal of continuing to prevent illness and then, of course, reduce any economic harm. And so FDA already has a regulation where many know it as one up, one back, or Subpart J. And within this regulation, it really sets the standard for what the record keeping for all foods look like. But over the years, after the adoption of that particular regulation, we started to learn that one up, one back record keeping did not really capture all of the data elements that we felt were necessary to effectively and rapidly link shipments of foods through each supply chain, each point in the supply chain. And so there were some significant gaps where we identified, a lack of coverage for all sectors that were involved in the food production, the distribution, the sales. So we know farms and restaurants are exempt, particularly from Subpart J, which they are included in the food traceability rule. We also learned that, there was a lack of uniform data collection. So the Subpart J doesn't really require them to record a lot code or any other specific identifier for all the foods. And as you can imagine, that makes it difficult to try and link products, especially from products that are incoming and the outgoing products within a single firm, let alone from one point in the supply chain to the next. And so through these learnings and shortcomings that we were experiencing with Subpart J, it really hindered our effectiveness when it came to FDA's outbreak investigations in many ways, including making it, more difficult to obtain tracing information from point of service, where obviously most of our investigations begin because that is where people consume or purchase their foods that made them sick, since they are exempt from Subpart J. So there was a gap in the information that we were actually able to collect at those points. And so even when that information is available at point of sale or point of service, the records required under Subpart J are often inadequate to help us really facilitate that swift and accurate traceback through the distribution chain to the producer of the contaminated food. So the hope was through the development of the food traceability rule, which, as you mentioned, was established under Section 204 of the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, it really requires these covered entities that specifically manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods on the food traceability list to maintain these additional records that will really help facilitate the rapid and accurate tracing of these foods. And so the requirements of the food traceability rule will really help shape and standardize the language so that industry itself will understand what data points we need to help make that conversation a lot easier when we are doing that data collection. So for those that may not be familiar, of course, the food traceability list it covers most commodities that we consume. And so some examples of those commodities include leafy greens. We'll have soft and semi-soft cheeses, shell eggs, of course, fresh cut produce. And so there are a variety of commodities that are included on the food traceability list. And so again, we will now be able to expand our reach when it comes to this data collection process that will again help us to more rapidly and effectively identify the recipients of the food, and of course to help prevent or mitigate any of these foodborne illness outbreaks or other public health threats that may come up. And so at the core of the rule itself is this requirement for persons that are subject to the rule to maintain these key data elements, or KDEs, associated with specific critical tracking events, or CTEs, and provide that information to FDA within 24 hours in an electronic sortable spreadsheet when it's required or if there's no other exemption. And having this data, these KDEs for each CTE that are performed, really help again with the analysis process, because it allows us to have more standard information across all of industry, as opposed to what we see now, where it's a little bit more sporadic depending on what firm you're dealing with and where they are in their traceability journey. Another really important concept of the food traceability rule is this traceability lot code. And it is really, I can't stress enough how integral of a component of the rule this particular KDE is. It really helps link the other key data elements that are required, including the TLC source, which provides the physical location where the traceability lot code for the food was assigned. It really helps us, again, create those linkages and ensure that we're following the same product across the supply chain. I think one particular example that we see current day is often there are a lot of changes when it comes to lot code numbers, other identifiers, product descriptions. And so sometimes as we're following foods across the supply chain, it makes it difficult to really ensure that you're following the particular lot of potentially contaminated food that you're interested in. And so by having this traceability lot code, it really identifies when the traceability lot code can be assigned in this rule, and make sure that it stays the same as the food moves through the supply chain unless transformation occurs. So the rule itself identifies specific points in the supply chain where certain entities can assign the traceability lot code, and then ensures that that same lot code moves across the supply chain. So again, helping us to ensure that those linkages are present. So what this means is that during an outbreak, FDA investigators will be able to go to a store or a particular restaurant where that food is sold and potentially find out the TLC source, and immediately know the location of where that food was manufactured or transformed. And so as you can imagine, this is monumental when it comes to time saving, because now we're going to walk in the door at the place where people purchased food or consumed food and have a lot more data about either where that food was transformed or where that food was handled in a particular way or manufactured in a particular way, as opposed to, with Subpart J having to go one step by step. So then going from, the restaurant or the store to then a distribution center, and then from the distribution center collecting data about who manufactured the food or did some other processing to the food. We will be able to kind of skip these steps and more quickly be able to identify points where the food could have been contaminated, and still have the opportunity to collect information from those other points, but also be able to better prioritize and scope our process in this outbreak situation. Because obviously, the point of it all is to get to the point where it was manufactured or the point where contamination occurred as quickly as possible.
So that's a great explanation. And, kind of when I step back and think about it, it's really about, for FTL Foods, setting a rule set, right, in terms of like how the identity of that food is preserved as it moves through the supply chain, and really, how is that traceability lot code maintained so that, it can't change at random points, that we know we're looking at the same food as it moves through space and time, and that really definitely helps with that investigatory piece. Adam, from an FDA perspective, we look at the compliance date right now for the rule is July 20th, 2028. Why is it important from an FDA perspective that the food industry start thinking about compliance with the rule now?
Thanks, Ben. I'm just thinking back to what I was saying a few moments ago. We published this final rule back in November of 2022, so 3.5 years ago, almost 4 years ago now. And I remember in those early days after we published the final rule, um, people were asking a lot of questions like, oh, what does this key data element mean? But where we are now in 2026, what I've realized is there has been truly significant progress towards implementation, towards compliance with the rule. People are starting to speak that same traceability language. We're talking about traceability lot codes, traceability lot code sources, and source references. And even just moving beyond the definitions, people are starting to talk to one another about how can we work within our own supply chains to make sure that we have all of the data elements needed, especially given some points in the supply chain historically have not been a place where traceability information is captured that comprehensively. So there are still challenges, but I think we should also recognize the truly great progress that has been made in the 3.5 years since the publication of this final rule. So, you know, I still believe people should be thinking about compliance now, being forward thinking. This compliance date is going to come sooner rather than later. It's going to come very quickly, faster than we think. So it's going to require substantial operational or even system changes, and that could include updates to record keeping practices, supplier coordination, talking to your suppliers. If I am not receiving a key data element or a few key data elements, um, how am I reaching back out to my suppliers to say, hey, I noticed that this one is missing. How can I access this data element in the lead up to the compliance date? There's also staff training as well, and potentially technology investments that have been made or need to be made. And I should note that the food traceability rule does not prescribe any particular technology for the maintenance of records. So firms can use paper or electronic records to meet the requirements of the rule. But we're hearing that companies are starting to think about how to utilize technology more so than before. But paper is certainly still perfectly acceptable. So these businesses will need to take this time leading up to compliance um, to ensure that the required data can be captured and then shared efficiently and effectively. So early preparation will allow those firms to test their processes, identify those gaps, work collaboratively with their trading partners. So FDA encourages those companies to begin now so they can implement, sustainable, scalable traceability systems and avoid those last minute challenges with compliance as we approach the July of 2028 compliance date. So, my word of advice, my personal word of advice is continue to work with your supply chain partners, work within your own internal and external teams, and really develop that plan to make sure that you are capturing those key data elements for each of the critical tracking events that you perform. And if you don't, you know, work within your own supply chain, talk to your supply chain partners, and figure out a scalable method that um, can be used to fulfill those requirements of the rule. So I think that over the next 2 years in the lead up to compliance, even more progress is going to be made in this regard. So yeah, more work to do, but people are doing a really great job, and I want to encourage that continued good work.
I want to thank you both. That's great context to set up and give people background on the rule, especially as we then move now to talking about what the specific pilots that PFT are hosting will look like. You know, this is the phase in which we head into preparing for the final test. This is a good homework exercise for folks that want to take that on over the next year or so. So, thank you both. It's been a pleasure, and really appreciate the partnership between PFT and FDA. Thanks. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the FDA electronic sortable spreadsheet. Angela, Section 1.1455 of the rule requires firms to submit information in an electronic sortable spreadsheet. What is the ESS and what is it for?
During a recall or other threats to public health, the food traceability rule requires companies to provide to FDA upon request an electronic sortable spreadsheet, and that really just contains the key data elements for each critical tracking event that the company performs. Of course, unless there are certain exemptions that may apply. So FDA will only ask for this ESS during an outbreak investigation or some other public health event. And when those companies send us this electronic sortable spreadsheet, they have to provide it to us within 24 hours of the request. Or if there's some other reasonable time, which we'll agree upon, in that specific situation. Obviously, we have to take into account international firms with timing. So, time zones can get crazy. So we want to make sure that we're giving firms enough time to develop the spreadsheet and provide us the data that they need as quickly as they can, but within a reasonable time. And so I think the most important piece about the spreadsheet is that it really allows us to more rapidly analyze our traceability data compared to how we currently do it now. Currently, we have our method of reviewing business records and making these linkages by trying to look at, various bills of lading or invoices, and doing that on a one-by-one basis. And so not having that information collated, not always having that information in a way where we can kind of manipulate the data to isolate, lot codes or pull specific locations out and be able to really sort through the information to help us organize it better. It really creates a lot of time burden on us as we're analyzing those records. And so the benefit of having this electronic sortable spreadsheet will really allow us to pull out the pieces of data that we need in our analytical process and help us to really hone in on what we're looking for to help us more rapidly analyze the information, as opposed to, going stepwise and then having to compile that data ourselves.
A lot of sense. Thank you, Angela. Adam, is the FDA template mandatory, or can a company use its own structure?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ben. We've actually been receiving this question pretty frequently recently. So the answer is no, the FDA electronic sortable spreadsheet template is not mandatory. The template that we created a few years ago now is just meant for illustrative or educational purposes. You are not required to use this specific electronic sortable spreadsheet template to comply with the rule. However, companies can feel free to use this template to fulfill a data submission request for FDA in accordance with the rule, but they're also welcome to use their own structure template, as long as their submission includes the required key data elements for each of the critical tracking events that they perform.
somebody looking at the template on the FDA website, and that's available kind of on that main traceability website. It's there kind of under the drop down list. You can go and download it. But somebody looking at that for the first time might find it maybe a little complicated. Why is the published template structured the way that it is, and how should people go about thinking, using it if they're going to use it? And I'll actually pop it up here so that we can take a look at it as you talk through your response.
So, as Ben is pulling it up, I just wanted to mention that we have this template available on our food traceability rule landing page. You can download it, and there's also a PDF version. And we also have translated it into a few different languages as well. And before we jump into this specific electronic sortable spreadsheet, we also have an example template that shows synthetic or hypothetical data. So that's another downloadable file that you can retrieve directly from our website. So on the page that you see on the screen, you'll see that there are definitions, definitions from the rule. What is a critical tracking event? What is the definition of a farm? What is the food traceability list? So that first tab is just a definitions of terms that you will find in the regulation. And in the different tabs that you see next to it as well, you'll see harvesting, cooling, initial packing, so on and so forth. Those represent each of the critical tracking events under the rule. So we categorically looked at every critical tracking event, and we're looking at harvesting right now. And you'll see that each of the column headers represent each of the key data elements that are required for that specific critical tracking event. So we were very methodical about how we organize this, and it's really meant for educational purposes, as I said before. And we wanted to make sure that people who are downloading this, reviewing this specific template, know that there are certain critical tracking events that may have multiple components within their own. So, for example, location description information may have multiple components: city, state, zip code, country. Um, the way that we created this spreadsheet template is we just broke out each of those individual components within a larger key data element for their own column. But if a company chooses to have their entire location description information in one single column, they're free to do so. We just did this for accessibility purposes. And I will say that we couldn't publish, to your point about people may find this a bit complicated or even confusing, we couldn't publish this template for every possible scenario in the supply chain. So we really tried to develop this template so anyone could use, learn based on the CTEs that they performed. But I think it's important to mention, because we've gotten this question a lot, is when you submit this template to FDA, do I need to fill out all of the different tabs? The answer is no. You only need to fill out the tabs for the critical tracking events that you perform. So if you're only performing receiving, you only need to send us receiving. Or if you're transforming and shipping and receiving, then you need to fill those three out. So just pay attention to what critical tracking events that you perform, and hopefully this template can serve as a guide to help people as they think about how they may want to submit an electronic sortable spreadsheet if they have to in the future once the compliance date is reached. Angela, I'm curious if you have anything further to add. I know that was pretty long-winded.
Adam, I think you really did touch on everything. I just want to reiterate that last point you made because, like you said, we've got a lot of questions about, how much information is required. Do I have to have a full pedigree by submitting this electronic sortable spreadsheet? And so I think it's really important for firms to realize that we understand that there'll be varying dispositions that will receive the spreadsheet in. We understand that there'll be varying levels of collaboration that will also occur. And so while it's not required in the rule for you to work with your supply chain partners to complete the electronic sort of spreadsheet upon submission, we know that typically we have seen a lot of firms do that with their trading partners. So they'll, be able to provide us in totality more of what would potentially be considered a pedigree just based on that collaboration with their supply chain. So, again, it's not required that you fill out any other tab aside from the critical tracking event that you perform specifically. But of course, we will always welcome, if you do work with your trading partners and are able to provide, more information for the various other critical tracking events throughout the supply chain. That will, of course, always increase our ability to be more efficient and effective by having that information on the front end.
Well, thank you both. That's very helpful. And I think, as you said, firms can think about this as a template for, right, the CTEs that the rule speaks to, as well as the KDEs that apply to each one of those CTEs. But right, you're not expecting that somebody's going to fill out every single tab. It's really going to be situationally dependent on the information they're asked to provide as part of a traceback investigation. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that sounds right. Just making sure that they're paying attention to the critical tracking events that they perform and the key data elements that fall within each of those critical tracking events. So they can format their spreadsheet however they want. We're most interested in the data itself.
Well, thank you both again for that in-depth explanation, and we'll look forward to seeing how people use and interact with the template as we move towards that compliance date. So, thanks. I'm joined now by Andy Kennedy from New Era Partners to discuss Pilot 1, which is the Traceability Lot Code Flexibility Pilot. Andy's a member of the Partnership for Food Traceability and previously spent time in the Human Foods Program actually working on the traceability rule when he was at FDA. So it's a pleasure to have you with us, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, for inviting me today. Definitely looking forward to talking about Pilot One.
Excellent. So,
Okay.
Andy, what's the motivation behind Pilot One, which is kind of lot code flexibility?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ben. FDA was directed by Congress as part of the Continuing Appropriation Act, Section 780, to engage with the industry to figure out, additional flexibilities for the lot level tracking requirement that's in FSMA 204. So they had a certain time limit to work on that. Recently, they've come out with FDA has released kind of a working document to discuss some of the challenges. So based on that document, they have a lot of questions. So this pilot is really intended for the industry to answer some of the questions raised in that working document.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, those were keeping tracks, all that come out. I think it was end of November last year that charged FDA with a number of things, one of which is that lot level tracking flexibility. And so really that's what we're leaning into in Pilot 1 here. So tell us a little bit, Andy, about the template that we've designed here as part of these pilot submissions, and what are we trying to solve for in terms of Pilot 1? What should people be thinking about?
Yeah. So what we did in order to create some uniformity to how the pilots are organized and how they report out to their peers, we've created this pilot template. So, first off, you kind of describe who's involved with the pilot, and then your pilot approach. So really, just in a short couple paragraphs, describe your pilot, which is kind of your elevator pitch, as it were, for your pilot. then what activities specifically did you do with this pilot? And then what are your findings from the pilot from an operational, technical, business, and organizational perspective? So it's really important to not just look at the technology, but also the impact on the people in the organization. And then based on the information that you collect along the way and all your learnings and so forth, create those recommendations. And that's really key, is to explain to people, like, based on the pilot work that you've done, to the FDA and to the industry, what are your recommendations? And then there's a optional section at the end for additional information that we may not have thought of in this pilot template. So we leave space in there so you can explain, some additional things that you want to include about your pilot. So, and to answer to your question about, like, what's an example look like, I've shared the pilot summary and objectives from a recent pilot that I worked on with our parent company, iFood DS. Dr. Claire Zellner led this work with several distribution companies. And essentially, what we were trying to figure out is how we can do lot level traceability based on the information that's already collected inside warehouse management systems, inside distribution centers. So how do we alleviate the need to scan every case? So that was kind of the idea for this pilot. And then some of the questions that we tried to answer is, from an operational perspective, what does that look like? What are the algorithms and types of algorithms required to do this? What data is there? What data is missing? How reliable are these algorithms? So we want to do some sensitivity analysis, and then also be able to, create different report outs to FDA to how we want to communicate that information to FDA in terms of, some of the different algorithmic approaches, and compare and contrast them. So that was the nature of the pilot. So this gives you an example of, one piece of the supply chain where we tackle this traceability lot code flexibility question. And this was a great example of, like, really zooming in on one particular problem, one particular part of the supply chain. But there's certainly others. There's challenges up and down the supply chain and how that information is collected, stored, and shared.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I know that that end of the supply chain has kind of wrestled with lot level traceability quite a bit. And what I like about the approach that we're taking here, and that you did in this pilot, was to really kind of define those questions. So I think as people think about what is the question I'm trying to solve for, that will really help drive and frame their approach to a pilot should they choose to participate in one of these. So I think this is a great example, and thank you for sharing it. What resources are there or previous work that interested participants can build on or potentially leverage for working on their pilot?
Yeah, so luckily PFT has organized several resource pages. One specifically for the pilot program. So that has the pilot template, also explains all the different pilots that are going on, and you can access those resources right from the PFT site. There's a resource page on the PFT website, which does a great job of organizing the links to all the FDA resources, the industry resources, and you can kind of leg off that and find a whole bunch of resources. It's got everything from, like, the Produce Traceability Initiative resources to GS1 to FDA. So that's all available there from the PFT resource page. And the new one is the FDA discussion paper on traceability lot code flexibility. So I've provided the link to that paper, and I imagine that will be added to the PFT resource page, along with other information that will be coming out related to upcoming webinars that FDA is going to be holding, the June 15th webinar and so forth. All that information should be available from PFT.
Perfect. Yeah, there's a lot of good resources out there. So I certainly invite people that may be watching to go check that out and access that. You mentioned the FDA discussion paper, which was released in late May of 2026. So how could that inform, people that might be interested in doing a pilot in this space? What are some of the areas that they might explore coming out of that FDA discussion paper?
Yeah, this discussion paper is great because it gives you a lot of material to focus on for pilots. I've extracted just a couple of the questions here. So, for example, one possible solution for TLC flexibility might be providing a range of lock codes. So FDA asks a question, well, how do you define a reasonable range of TLCs to provide? So that's one question that could be taken up by a pilot working group. And then what guardrails would you need to put in place to ensure the flexibility doesn't erode public health confidence in the rule? So, you know, 2 or 3 lock codes may be fine, 5, 10, where do you draw the line? When does it become, just basically every lock code that passed through your facility in the last 8 weeks, So how do we narrow that down? What are the guardrails? What are the limits? So for the inferred traceability lock codes, a good question that FDA asked for was, how can this flexibility be a stepping stone to full compliance? So are we saying that the flexibility is permanent and that's it, and that's all we're ever going to do? Or is this an entry point? Is it the MVP, as it were, for traceability for the industry? And what does that journey look like? So a pilot group may think about like the good, better, best approach to traceability and how this may be the first step. It's an entry point. You get your sortable spreadsheet built based on this data. You're able to share some information downstream with your trading partner. But this helps you build the systems and inform how you might improve them and get that the range of TLC down to the actual TLC. So that's a good question they raised. Eaches has been a big topic. So we've heard a lot from especially the convenience distributors that distribute a lot of eaches. FDA asks, what are the unique traceability challenges for eaches? They're picked out of the case and put into totes. So now you've lost the case barcode, for example. That creates a unique challenge. And then are the solutions that are identified, the range of lock codes, the inferred traceability lock code, is that good enough for eaches, or do you need something different? And then finally, intra-company shipments. And by the way, there are other issues raised in the discussion paper. I just happened to select these 4. But intra-company shipments are, that's a challenge that many people have brought up. Moving products, within your organization from one facility to another. That could be, DC to DC. That could be store back to the DC for a return. There'd be all kinds of different movements from production to facility to, cold storage. There's all kinds of different movements that happen inside a firm. What are those challenges? And then what are some flexibilities that might alleviate those challenges? So these are a couple nuggets. And yeah, check out that discussion paper because there's all kinds of good ideas for a pilot group 1 pilot. And yeah, I look forward to seeing what people come up with as they read through that paper and ideas that they come up with for their pilots.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great resource to go and check out in terms of where's the agency. I think trying to meet industry where it is to some extent. You talked about kind of good, better, best, and we talk about that quite a bit as part of PFT. As these technologies and approaches mature, some of these things may change, but I think again, knowing the compliance date's July of 2028, that's going to come quickly. And if you haven't started to think about or test your systems, that paper can be a great place to start and say, okay, well, what flexibilities might there be, and can I pilot that, and what does that look like? So I really appreciate you summarizing those resources, but would certainly invite folks to go and look at that and read it kind of end to end. I think it's about 3-4 pages, so it's not too long, but there's a lot of good material in there. Finally, if people want to participate in a pilot, you can always go to the PFT website, and there's a link there, pilot program. You can copy the URL here. There's a form that you can fill out at the end of the page with your contact information, and you have the opportunity to say, am interested in learning more about a pilot or sharing information from a pilot that I've already conducted, or if there's another reason that you want to reach out, that's a good mechanism to do that. In another part of this webinar, we'll talk about the pilot template and how to fill that out and what that looks like. But Andy, I want to thank you for taking time to walk people through what opportunities there are as it relates to Pilot One and some of the experiences you've had. And thank you for all the work that you've done on behalf of the PFT.
Thanks Ben for inviting me today, and I look forward to hearing some of the great ideas that come out from the folks joining these pilots, because it's amazing the energy in this space and the creativity. So I really do look forward to working with folks. And one reason why we're having these webinars and these meetings is so we can share the information, best practices, and experiences, and also so we don't duplicate pilots a lot. So that's another challenge, because if everyone goes off and does their own thing and doesn't share what they're working on, we could have 50 pilots on one issue and no pilots on any of the other issues. So I think it's really good to have a forum like this to discuss what's going on in the industry, who's working on what, and share contact information and learn from each other as we go along.
Absolutely. And I know we've mentioned it elsewhere in this webinar, but you don't have to be a PFT member to participate. We always certainly, can share information about membership if people are curious and interested, but anybody can participate in these pilots, and we'll aggregate and share that information and the summary of that work publicly if that's what you want done. That's part of the template process. So Andy, again, thank you. Appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day.
All right. Thanks a lot, Ben.
We've just heard from FDA about the electronic sortable spreadsheet and the background and intent behind that ESS. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the Pilot 2, which is data sharing using the ESS. So for Pilot 2, we're looking for interested participants to use the ESS format that FDA has to capture key data elements and critical tracking events throughout their section of the supply chain. I think an important call out here is that you don't have to fill out the entire ESS. It's going to be for the portion of the supply chain where you have product that's being distributed. So, for example, that might be critical tracking events that relate to shipping. If you're sending product to a grocery store, they might be a receiving critical tracking event if you're receiving product at that end of the supply chain. So really this pilot's designed to share that ESS with the Partnership for Food Traceability, with the pilot working group and the pilot committee, and we will be reviewing that for completeness and usability and providing feedback to those that choose to participate in this pilot. You have the option of using real data if that's what you'd like to do, or you can create kind of de-identified or dummy data and submit that to us as well. But really the goal here is, if you're a participant, to see, can you pull your key data elements out of your existing systems and put them into that ESS format. Again, not something that's required by the regulation. You don't have to use the ESS, but FDA has put that template out there, and it's a good tool if you want to test the ability of your systems to extract that data and put it into that ESS format. Some of the other things that participants might expect to look at is, are each one of the data elements present, correctly labeled, and can you trace or link them back to the source that they're coming from within your data system? And then where gaps show up, what would it take to close those before a real request arrives? And remember that when FDA comes and asks for this information per the regulation, that you have a 24-hour period to provide them with an electronic sortable spreadsheet. And what are we really trying to accomplish or test here? One, the FDA, again, needs access to data in a structured way. And again, the way that they've put it in the rule, section 1.1455, speaks to this electronic sortable spreadsheet. And readiness isn't just a data problem, right? Obviously, you're going to be, or participants or companies looking to be compliant are going to have this data, but it's a matter of, have you set up the system ahead of time to be able to pull and extract that data into a format that you can share with the agency? So this is a great opportunity for companies that might be in a place where they have put those data systems in place. They are capturing the TLCs, they are capturing the traceability lot code source, they are capturing that level of information. Now can I export that and share that for my portion of the supply chain with the agency, should that be needed? To clarify again, this pilot is going to be sharing that data with the PFT for review, not directly with FDA, but we'll be able to provide good feedback on that. And we've covered this in good conversation with FDA earlier in the webinar, talked about the requirements, talked about what the ESS is and really what it's for. This slide really just reemphasizes those points that Adam and Angela spoke so well to. And again, just to remind folks, the ESS, not a requirement, but really the purpose of this pilot is to be able to test that type of data structure and see if your system can do and share data in that way. So those that might be interested in completing the pilot, first start out by picking the scope and what product do you want to trace, what CTEs do you have, what KDEs are required at those particular CTEs. Then pull those source records from your existing systems or trading partners and start to build out that ESS. Build it one data element per column, one row per event, using the structure that FDA has put in place as part of that template. And it's important to check completeness. Were you able to populate every KDE in that spreadsheet as part of your data pull? Also, time the exercise. How long did it take to produce that file? The first time you're doing this exercise, it may take longer. Once you have that query set up within your system, it should hopefully be a push of a button to generate something like the ESS file once you define the product and the date range of interest. And record what was missing or hard to find and what you changed to fix it. That's going to be important information to share with others who might be engaging in Pilot 2 as well. And then share that ESS in a short narrative with PFT using the pilot form, and all of that information will be available on the PFT website. There are some resources out there to get you started. There's a number of resources along those lines on the PFT website, as well as on FDA's food traceability rule website. And FDA, as was discussed earlier in the webinar, has that downloadable ESS template in a number of different languages. And they also have an example where that's filled in. So thank you. We look forward to those that might be interested in participating in Pilot 2, and happy piloting. I'm joined now by Frederick Clulo from Kessler and Wiggs Civitillo from Starfish, and we'll be discussing Pilot 3 and interoperability now. So Wiggs, do you want to introduce yourself, and then Frederick?
Yeah, thanks for the intro. I'm Wiggs Civitillo. I'm the CEO and founder of Starfish. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks for the intro, Ben. My name is Frederick Clulo. I am responsible for Kessler's traceability portfolio of services across North America.
Excellent. Well, we're here to talk about Pilot 3, which is industry interoperability. So, Wiggs, do you want to describe the pilot in simple terms? What are we trying to do here?
Absolutely, yeah. So when it comes to interoperability, this is a really important piece of what's required for FSMA 204. So FSMA 204 not only requires you to capture records within your own organization, but to exchange supply chain records and key data elements for critical tracking events with your trading partners. This pilot is designed to allow 2 or more partners to exchange traceability data that the rule requires using the systems and data formats that they already have in place. Interoperability happens when these systems are able to communicate with each other, and one company sends the data, the other receives, interprets, and confirms that it can act on the data. So we're answering a few critical questions. So can a shipper and receiver exchange these key data elements with each other? Does master data propagate so that it's usable when the receiver actually receives that information? How long does the exchange take, and where does that handoff break down?
Thanks. So this is really about getting people to start to trade data and pass data within the supply chain. That's really what we're talking about here. And how do we do that potentially using standards? Frederick, can you tell us, why is this pilot important in the context of the rule, and why is interoperability important overall?
Absolutely. The reality is that we have a very diverse supply chain within food and bev. That means that we have diversity of systems, we have diversity of data standards, and all of these need to be able to talk to each other. Not only is there diversity in the type of systems, but there's also diversity in how the data is exchanged between different members of the supply chain. And therefore, the real challenge isn't capturing the data. The reality is that most enterprises will have the data. The challenge is in exchanging the data between all these different parties in a way that they can all understand each other. We all want to make sure that we're all speaking the same challenge. And so the idea behind this pilot is to be able to do, if you want, a giant UAT where certain elements of the supply chain are willing to partake and test whether or not they're able to exchange the KDEs for relevant CTEs in a manner that everybody can understand. So we make sure that we're all speaking the same language and that we can all understand each other and aggregate all that data in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, Wiggs, when we think about what are some of the common methods of data sharing today and, how does this pilot support those? We kind of start at that human readable kind of paper level. There's still a lot of trade that happens right now at that level. But what are we thinking about in terms of pilot 3 here?
Yeah, based on the federal law, it's important that each company is able to exchange data and submit data and collect data in the way that is best for them, right? Best for their capabilities, best for their operational structure. In some cases, paper and human readable documents are best. And in others, more digital methods of exchanging information, right, via APIs, via spreadsheets, data networks, or even using QR codes or non-GS1 barcodes all work, right? And that's all able to be accepted by the FDA as long as it has the right data elements and it's exchangeable between your trading partners. There are many data standards that support this. Notably, GS1 provides data standards for global trade identification numbers, global location numbers, GLNs, GTINs, and EDI or EPCIS can be used and is used very commonly for exchanging event data. So within this framework, a lot of the work that we're focused on certainly comes in that third category where GS1 has laid a foundation for a data standard that can be used to facilitate interoperability, although testing and piloting exchanges between systems that use proprietary formats or other digital formats is great. And even testing solutions that involve paper documents are also great. So this pilot is open to anyone on all fronts, although we're expecting to see a skew towards that third category.
So last year, Kessler, Starfish, and Pure Ledger, along with PFT, kind of leaned into this idea. And I think, this is good because it sort of plants the groundwork or kind of shows what's possible for Pilot 3 here. And this, we're going to have a white paper up on the PFT website here shortly that really describes some of the learnings from that and the approach that we took. But for people looking at the screen here, we created synthetic data that looked at cucumber supply chains from all the way from those growing cucumbers flowing through the supply chain to processing to distribution to retail. And we based that off of the GS1 standards. So we use things like the GTIN and we use GLNs and things like that to essentially kind of create the ideal data set. It was a good exercise. I think we learned a lot in that process. What can you tell us, from your perspectives, did we learn as part of that data sharing exercise or pilot that we did?
Yeah, I'll kick us off by sharing. It was a great collaborative experience with a few technology providers that have been in this space for a long time, experts within traceability, working through scenarios with real products and making sure that the data can flow. Right, we were able to successfully test and prove that interoperability works among systems. We can have methods to automate data sharing in a secure and trusted way, and that can happen and is happening quite a bit in the real world today. We know some common challenges, right? Certainly, as mentioned earlier in the presentation, master data alignment can be a real challenge, right? If you ship a product to someone where that location and product description doesn't go with the actual transition, it's very difficult for a receiving system to interpret that code, right, or that information. Typically, what we're expecting is a product and lot code combination when it's received, but sometimes that doesn't get shared, and when that's missing, that can cause issues. To that point, standards utilization does dramatically reduce friction. So using shared identifiers, GS1 keys like GTINs and GLNs, and structured event formats like EPCIS is really wonderful to allow partners and something that we used with this pilot that helped make this a faster and more efficient time to deployment and a greater success in general. Fritz, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Wiggs. I think what was really interesting to me is that we had vastly different data architectures. We had platforms that were blockchain, we had non-blockchain platforms. They were running on different infrastructure. So vastly different technology came together, and we demonstrated the capacity through EPCIS of all these different platforms to speak the same language, as I was saying before, so that we were all able to exchange data regardless of the internal data structure that each respective provider was using. And we were able to, in essence, reconstruct that data transfer all the way from inception to what was the emulated retailer at the end of the supply chain. And I think that that was really essential to demonstrate interoperability and the essence of it. What I would add as well, I think one of the biggest learnings here is to start small, right? So how do you eat an elephant? Because interoperability is a big word, right? Lots of different moving parts, lots of different moving data languages. But the reality is you eat an elephant by taking one bite at a time. And that's really, I think, something that was key here was really just taking every bit step by step. Let's start with aligning the master data. As Wiggs mentioned, let's make sure that we have a common understanding there. But then also move bit by bit with different CTs and then build up. Don't try to do everything. Don't try to just send the shipping, receiving, transformation events all at once. Just like take it one step, make sure that you have a learning process that iterates on that, document everything, and then just move forward from there. And I think that was key. And the result, I think, was a wildly successful pilot.
Yeah, and a special thanks to Bob Celeste at the Center for Supply Chain Studies. He helped us build this kind of laboratory that went from end to end looking at that data. And I think one of the things that stuck with me as part of that pilot was, we kind of created the perfect scenario, I think, in terms of data. There were some things we needed to clean up, but even with that in place, it demonstrated the importance of having those planning conversations in terms of mapping the data between entities in the supply chain, between those critical tracking events. So it's can feel like it should be straightforward, but oftentimes it's not, even under kind of ideal circumstances. And again, it's why this pilot is so important. It's the opportunity for people to get out there and start to test data sharing, between trading partners in the supply chain. That compliance date of July 20th, 2028, it's going to come pretty quick, and we want people to have thought through what this looks like. So, I think for those interested in participating, how would they complete this pilot? I'm not going to go through each one of these bullet points up here, but I want to emphasize the first one, and that's thinking about picking a partner and doing what we talked about, in terms of mapping out those CTEs and KDEs and figuring out what that initial data structure looks like as part of your participation in the pilot. And there are, we've got things listed out here. Those details will also be on the PFT website under Pilot 3 for those that are interested in participating. Gentlemen, final question. Can you walk us through just some of the resources? People are interested in participating. Where's a good place to start if they want to get some additional background before rolling up their sleeves and getting into this?
Yeah, I'd recommend a great place to start will be the PFT website, right, where you can learn more about the PFT pilot program. There's a resources page with templates and guidance. You certainly understand the requirements of the food traceability rule, FSMA 204, and taking a look at the food traceability list to identify where you're taking that first bite, where you're starting small and documenting. An understanding of standards and formats is helpful. And also just to highlight that there are a lot of folks in this community that are going to be more than willing to help. And even, on the PFT calls, we have a lot of great collaborative conversations about how best to identify challenges and work through challenges as we're going through these pilots together. So leverage our community and the support from PFT.
I would absolutely second that. I would definitely highlight that we're all in this together, and there's definitely a lot of collaboration across the entire industry because, again, interoperability. So we all have to make sure that we can collaborate and work with each other. So definitely community outreach is definitely crucial.
Yeah, and I appreciate that point, and I'll highlight, we've talked about this kind of throughout this webinar, but open to anybody, so open to the public. You don't have to be a PFT member. Obviously, if you're curious or interested in membership, you can go to the PFT website and learn more about what that looks like. But we're certainly inviting anybody and everybody to participate and share and kind of collaborate in that space. Gentlemen, thank you. Greatly appreciate it. Happy piloting, and we'll look forward to it.
Thank you, Ben.
We've come to the end of our PFT pilot recorded webinar, and we appreciate everybody's attention. The last section I'm going to cover is how to participate. So we've covered Pilot 1, Pilot 2, and Pilot 3, as well as background on the rule and background on the electronic sortable spreadsheet. So for those that might be interested in participating, you can go to the PFT website. Along the header bar there, you'll find pilot programs, and here's the URL as well. From there, you'll be able to scroll down and find information about each one of the individual pilots, the lot code flexibility, the ESS, and the interoperability pilot. So we'll have information listed on this website there. For those that would like to participate, there's a form at the bottom of the screen. So we certainly invite you to fill out some contact information, at which point in time we'll respond fairly quickly and get you the pilot information, the templates, have a discussion, just run through anything in terms of scope, answer any questions that you might have before starting that pilot. You'll find a lot of good information on the website, and so we invite people who are interested to go to the website, check it out, and sign up. Thank you for your attention today. I'm Ben Miller, one of the principal members of the PFT, and appreciate your time and attention. Happy piloting. That concludes today's PFT pilot webinar. We appreciate those who attended. On behalf of everyone at PFT, I want to thank you for your attention, and we hope that we've drawn some interest and that you'll be considering participating in one of the 3 pilots that we have. I'm Ben Miller, one of the principal members at the Public-Private Partnership, which is the PFT, and we look forward to hearing from you. Happy piloting.